Me and my girlfriend have been dreaming about going to Japan for many years. And last spring, we finally booked our tickets to Tokyo. This wasn't just a trip. It was going to be a journey into a culture that we had long admired. In this video, I want to share a couple of moments with you of the days that we spent exploring Tokyo. This is the hotel we stayed at, next to Sendagaya metro station. It's called Mitsui Garden Hotel. It's located in the middle of Tokyo and just a 7-minute metro ride from Shinjuku. I took this photo out of the window of the metro on our way to Shibuya. The hotel is built entirely out of wood and has a simple Japanese architecture that is completely symmetrical. And the outer wooden structure creates a nice play of shadows and light. This was the view from our balcony, and it was amazing. From here we could see Shinjuku, and in the evening there were countless lights that created an amazing city skyline. The hotel is located right next to the Tokyo National Stadium, used during the 2020 Summer Olympics. On our way to the metro, I stopped and saw this photo opportunity. The stadium has a very modern design, and the use of greenery on all the levels makes it feel like it has been there for a long time, and it fits right in. After stepping off the metro at Shibuya station, I got the glance at the famous Shibuya crossing, with its thousands of people crossing the streets at every red light. For a photographer, Tokyo is like a never-ending source of inspiration, and I fell in love with the Japanese culture from the moment that we arrived. I took this photo using a 1-second shutter to capture the chaotic flow of people, the pulse, and the lively feel of a city that never stands still. I find it fascinating that all these people are on their way somewhere. May it be an office, an apartment, a restaurant, or a school. When you stop for a second, you realize just how massive Tokyo really is. Just as I turned my head, I managed to get a shot of the famous Nintendo-inspired go-karts that you can rent and drive through Tokyo. It sure looks like a lot of fun. From Shibuya, we went to this laid-back neighborhood called Shimokitazawa. This is one of our favorite places in Tokyo. This is definitely the place to go if you're into specialty coffee shops and great secondhand shopping. The streets here are so narrow that only the tiniest cars and scooters are allowed. The buildings here are not more than a few stories high, and it really feels like you step back right into the 70s when you come here. Just next to the train tracks, I saw these repurposed shipping containers housing small shops and Japanese street foods of all kind. It's a creative way of fitting a lot into a tiny space, and making the most out of the space that you have is very typically Japanese. Before leaving Shimokitazawa, we stopped by Thrifty Coffee for a drink, and I just had to have this photo taken. I'm a really big fan of the 70s vibe they have going on here, and I think with my coat I fit right in. Food in Japan is more than a meal. It's an experience. From the bustling markets to the tiny udon stalls in hidden alleys, every bite speaks of precision, craft, and care. And I definitely had the best food that I've ever had during my stay in Tokyo. We made new friends everywhere we went, and people were so friendly. Here are some shots of the nice people that we met. The next day, we took the metro to Asakusa. The streets around the SensoJi temple are filled with amazing street food stalls, and the vibe here is very laid back. I took quite a few frames here, and I'm really happy with this photo of people exploring the food scene. For me, this photo feels like one of those shots where my eyes can just wander around for some time, and every time I look at it, I find new details that I hadn't seen before. I ended up spending a few hours here just enjoying my time in this vibrant place. Here's another one which I think turned out great. This is the Nakamizu shopping street that leads right up to the main attraction, the SensoJi temple. I wanted to capture the length of the street with all of its small gift shops and stores. We ended up buying way too many mochi and yokomo cakes from the vendors along this shopping street. During April, Japan is covered in beautiful cherry blossoms, and I really love this shot of the 5-storied pagoda in the late afternoon sun. I think there must have been a public holiday of some sort, because the amount of people lining up to pay their respects and wish for good luck at the temple were massive. Everywhere we went, there were so many Japanese couples dressed up in traditional clothing, even though it seemed like just any other Wednesday. The Japanese culture is so colorful and vibrant, and it makes for beautiful photos. Looking east, from where we were standing, you could see the 634-meter tall Tokyo Skytree. Being the world's 3rd tallest building, sure makes for quite a view. I'm really happy with the framing of this shot. I ended up waiting for quite a while to have people cross the street just at the right moment. This creates a natural subframing for the tower in the center of the image. The white lines on the crosswalk also creates leading lines that draw the attention to the main subject. Next up, we went to Ginza. This is the business district of Tokyo. Here, towering skyscrapers and luxurious apartment buildings share the same space as local businesses and restaurants. It creates opportunities for really interesting shots, having small shops crammed in between skyscrapers. I'm a little bit embarrassed, I have to admit. I ended up having to wait over an hour to get this iconic shot of the Tokyo Tower, but I think it was worth it. For this shot, I used my anamorphic 50mm lens, and I just managed to get the whole tower in the frame. If you look close, next to the top there is an observation deck for visitors to take in the vast views. Just as the sun was setting, I saw a pocket of light streaming in from behind the building, creating a dramatic backlight on the people walking down the street. And I stopped and waited for a while. A couple came walking towards me, and I snapped this photo. I think it turned out alright. But then, a minute later, a man dressed in all black came walking towards me. I waited for the exact moment that he would walk into the light. I think the timing of this one is perfect. If I would have taken the photo just a little bit too late or too soon, his posture and placement in the light would have been drastically different. I really hope you enjoyed tagging along, and I look forward to sharing more shoots in the future. Before saying goodbye, I would like to thank you for joining me on this journey through Tokyo. Capturing these moments and places allowed me to see Japan's absolutely huge capital in a new light, and I hope these images gave you a glimpse into the beauty and spirit of this incredible country. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing for more travel and photography adventures. And if you've been to Japan, let me know in the comments what memories you took back with you. I'll see you in the next one.